Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 9th of February 2015. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson. And behind the technical desk, Nick Green. Well, the weather, blue sky and sunshine again here in Plymouth, so we're very happy with that. Overnight temperatures down just below freezing. It's now a balmy 5 degrees, I think, possibly climbing. Across the country, similar weather really, with snow on the hills and high ground in some places, so enjoy that while you can, get those toboggans out. Well, as always, the political climate in Britain is becoming ever more plain to see as we watch chaos unfolding across our public infrastructure, across the civil service, within the NHS. And of course, we see everything driven by the famous cry of austerity. But let's remind ourselves that it's apparently already been agreed that it will be Nick Clegg who will be caretaker Prime Minister after the forthcoming election, which is designed to produce, of course, a super coalition. So let's have a look at Nick. Here he is. We put out a tweet over the weekend that effectively we thought Nick was saying, I'm so happy. Leon Brittan said I would be Prime Minister all those years ago when I was mentored to be a Europhile. And now they've told me I'll be Prime Minister for the chaotic period after the elections. No, I don't care that the planned super coalition is a one-party dictatorship or that I've never been elected. And, well, whoopee, I can't wait to get home and tell my wife. Well, what else has he been doing? Well, he's been popping into incredibly expensive hotels in order to host conferences on austerity. And I know, Mike, you're going to be talking about finances a little bit later in the news. But here we are, remarkable that Britain's general public, the population, now being simply told by the state who our next Prime Minister is going to be.
That's a big audience he's got.
One.
Yeah.
Well, this is true, but then he doesn't need an audience because it's all put out on Twitter at the moment.
Yeah.
And if you need a twit, well, clearly Nick Clegg fills the bill. But there we are. He is to be Britain's first unelected Prime Minister after the 2015 elections. Okay,
so what happens when you try to hack the Constitution? That is the question being asked by Conor Gearty in another opinion piece, which mirrors those he's been writing for a number of years now. Here's an example of one he wrote in October 2013 in The Guardian. And he says in this, as we celebrate 800 years since the signing of the Magna Carta, many believe that it is time for British values were clarified in a codified document for our age. The place to define them would be in a written constitution, given that the UK doesn't have one, he lied. But the UK is a melting point of cultures, he says, with 270 nationalities and 300 different languages spoken in London alone, so these values are not easily defined. It's impossible these days to define what are British values, he says. Efforts to do so by the government have proved hopelessly embarrassing. They have essentially amounted to parroting universal values and attempting to repackage them as British. So that's what he has to say. He then goes on to describe his initiative to crowdsource the Constitution. And a question that I have in mind is how can the crowd properly source a new constitution when they've no idea about the relationship they have with the state as is defined by the present one? So unsurprisingly, Gearty doesn't want to go in that direction. But then he goes on to say, as we hack the Constitution, we've been asking people what should go into a British Bill of Rights when completely ignoring that we currently have a British Bill of Rights. And here's the ultimate irony. It's important that the constitutional debate is not hijacked by the elite. And you'll understand why that's an irony in a second. It will culminate in a constitutional convention hosted by the London School of Economics in March, at which the top 20 participants from the crowdsourcing project will be invited to help finalise a written codified constitution. So that's not elitist in any way. We'll then present it to Parliament and see whether our politicians are ready for the kind of change being put forward to the people. So who is Conor Gearty? Well, here he is from his role within the Mary Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice. And he is a founder member of Matrix Chambers. Now, Matrix Chambers, that's not elitist in any way, is it?
No,
Brian?
that is the chambers of
Cherie Blair.
Cherie Blair,
Not
yes.
elitist at all, started in 2000. He has a practice which specialises in judicial review, which includes human rights law within its main fields. And he teaches graduate and undergraduate classes at the London School of Economics. London School of Economics, that's not elitist in any way, is it?
No, and it certainly hasn't got any agenda to completely transform the country in its own image.
Indeed. And he studied law at University College Dublin and went to Cambridge University. That's not elitist at all, is it, Brian?
No, I wouldn't say so.
No, and he took a master's degree in law there and a PhD in environmental law. And then he became a fellow in law at Emmanuel University and stayed in that job for several years before moving to King's College London, which almost also isn't elitist in any way.
Has he actually done a sort of productive job?
No.
Okay.
No, so that's Conor Gearty. He is absolutely driving the constitutional reform agenda in this country at the moment, and a really dangerous person in my opinion. So what do we do about it? Let's remind you once again of the British Constitution Group UK Column Spring Conference. I will be speaking about the constitutional reform agenda at that conference. Lots of other stuff going on over the 2 days as well, including the grand jury on the child abuse issue. Please have a look at the events.gb.com website. And of course, UK Column members and BCG members should order tickets through those respective websites to take advantage of members' discounts. Okay.
And it's vital. It's absolutely vital. If you are interested in doing something to stop the rot going on in Britain at the moment, come along to the conference. But also the key theme, which is the grand jury to look into the matters to do with child abuse, is going to be a real insight into how things work in UK and what we should be doing about it. So don't sit at home worrying. Perhaps you join us in Telford for that conference. Well, we said some years ago, excuse me, that child abuse was a key issue in Britain because it was by paedophilia, effectively, that our senior politicians and members of the establishment were, of course, being blackmailed in order to do the work of, well, we could debate the banks or indeed foreign powers or both. And of course, we see a massive cover-up at the moment by the British state to ensure that names of politicians and those establishment members do not come out. Interestingly, the MP John Mann was tweeting. He has tweeted out this over the last few days. New child abuse case in Nottingham, 10 victims and slave labour, and I was hoping it couldn't get any worse. Many people turned a blind eye. But let's have a look at some of the comments on top of this. Tragic for the victims of abuse, and there should be no financial compensation. So the focus is on justice, truth, and integrity. Now, let's remember, of course, in Nottingham, they tried to buy off child abuse victims. I'm just going to highlight this one, Nick, so if you hold it there a second. In Nottingham, Nottinghamshire City Council and County Council spent $250,000 trying to buy off child abuse victims. And this is the plan across the whole of the local authorities in Britain to keep it as effectively a civil action and to keep it out of the criminal courts. But somebody on this page was thinking properly, because here we have, let's get this right, it's not people, but hashtag common purpose. Why do you think it's nationwide? So somebody here now starting to look at the fact that we have case after case of child abuse. We have police investigations. Well, we have tens of them. We have 50 of them. We have more, and yet we are not getting a single person convicting of any status. So a common purpose of cover-up. And Exaro has stayed on the case of Leon Britton, and they've got a very interesting article here which is talking about Leon Britton being buried in an unmarked grave in a very private funeral. They're saying that there doesn't look as though there's going to be any large public service for him, and the family are very worried that his grave could be desecrated, basically. But this is a key part of the Exaro story, which we'd encourage you to go and read. They seem to have got hold of the death certificate, and it would appear that a single GP has decided the cause of death of this vital child abuse witness. So did he die of natural causes? Many people think he died at a very convenient time, but no post-mortem signed off by a single GP, buried, and that would appear to be the end of it. And he's been buried in the Golders Green Jewish cemetery, according to the Exaro article. Now, many people have contacted the UK column over the last few days talking about the North London child abuse case. And we'll say to our audience today that we have been aware of this case from the beginning. There's been a lot moving behind the scenes, some of which we can talk about and some of which we can't. However, for the first time, a video of two young children talking about serious sexual abuse, not only of themselves, but other children and babies. And indeed, these youngsters are talking about the murder of other children. The video has now appeared globally on the internet. So we've chosen to anonymize the images of the two children. We think this is fair enough. If you visit YouTube, it's easy enough now to find the video of these two young children taken. And of course, the video was taken before there was any involvement with the family courts. So what actually went on in this incident? Well, we're just going to give you a little snapshot of the timeline of the Golders Green child abuse cover-up. It started out with a mother and her partner discovering that the children had been abused, and we're talking about serious abuse, child abuse rings operating in local schools and churches. And it's also talking about children being murdered in the North London Golders Green area. The children identified close family members as abusers, as well as people connected with social services and other officials. The mother does the right thing. She goes to Barnet Social Services and Barnet Police for help. Within 24 hours, social services have used a secret family court to remove the children into care, and the mother, who is the protector of those children, is immediately denied contact. Within 24 hours, the Met Police, who are informed of the abuse, are allegedly threatened by other police officers to get their noses out. So once police officers had been told within the Met, they were warned off by other members of the Metropolitan Police. We understand that the Met Police Satanic Investigation Unit took no action, but within a week, the Met claimed that the children have retracted their statements. These two youngsters, 8 and 9 years old, but if we're to believe the police, they retracted their statements. And at a secret family court, in the secret family court proceedings, insiders now allege that social services barristers called for evidence to be destroyed. And by evidence, we believe they're referring to the videos. And of course, what does the local authority say? Well, here's the website, Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub. So the moment children speak out about their abuse, the hub ensures the cover-up, presumably. And we'll run on the quality of our politicians. This is David Cameron speaking about Leon Britton. He described him as dedicated and fiercely intelligent public servant. And David Cameron said as a central figure in Margaret Thatcher's government, he helped her transform our country. There's the word, Mike, you're talking about the Constitution. Transform our country for the better by giving distinguished service as Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Home Secretary and Secretary of State for Trade and Industry. Well, here's Mr. Cameron as far as the independent's concerned. And of course, he's been accused by other politicians, including Simon Danzuk, of wanting to move on and get away from allegations of paedophilia amongst politicians. And he also says, well, let's pay off the children. Rotherham child sex abuse victims will get cash, David Cameron says. So here's the buy-off, never mind bringing the abusers into court for proper trial and punishment. what does David Cameron want to do? Buy off the victims. But that's not all, because as David Cameron is showing, his real priority at the moment is not institutional child abuse, abusers in Westminster and the establishment. No, he's tweeting out that he's been taking selfies. So we just like to say, how long must the British nation suffer this Prime Minister who is clearly defective? We think
it's clearly only a few more months, and then we get another defective Prime Minister.
Well, we'll be getting Nick Clegg, who ran away, of course, at the big rally in London when he was asked by Bill Maloney what Nick Clegg, had done to help stop institutional child abuse. So we're going to get rid of defective Cameron, and we're going to replace him with Nick Clegg, who has run away from child abuse anyway. And of course, as we always say, we're not making any of this up. It's freely available in the mainstream press, provided you know where to look. And we get more clues as to the establishment cover-up in the UK. Tribune here reporting on an ex-spook who admits giving big names to the Conservative MP Dickinson in the so-called sex dossier. So lots of information in this article, which we encourage you to read. But here we've got one of the officials who should certainly know what was going on, saying that big names were included. Exaro reminded us, quite rightly, that as Home Secretary from 1983 to 85 in Margaret Thatcher's government, Britain was responsible for the police special branch and the security service MI5. So maybe that's why nobody knew about Jimmy Savile, nobody knew about paedophiles in government, because a man being accused was in fact in control of all the security agencies. And we get another part of this from the BBC here, where it's reporting that GCHQ will be helping to tackle the dark net and child abuse images. But we say to our audience today, let's look at this a little bit more deeply, because what is really going on here is that David Cameron and the BBC are obfuscating, they're blurring the issue of child abuse to nudge people away from the idea that there are paedophiles in power. So basically, the security services who have failed to investigate paedophiles in government are now apparently the same people tasked to investigate online abuses. We've also got David Cameron saying that online child exploitation is almost industrial in scale. But how would he know that if GCHQ, MI5 and MI6 are simply unable to identify and warn of paedophiles in government? Well, overall, the BBC message is that, of course, paedophiles are anonymous individuals who do their work online. So the BBC, once again, helping to divert public attention away from victims and evidence coming forward that political and establishment people abuse. And, of course, those same establishment figures are above the law. Pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Well, something that comes through to us constantly is criticism from people who allege they've been abused for the so-called authorities and institutions that say they are there to help them. And we have to say that we've had a lot of criticism pointed at NSPCC. We're investigating this to see whether it's justified. But this was pointed out to us today, and many people unhappy about it. There is a cartoon available on the NSPCC site which says, "Share Aware, help your child stay safe on social networks." And it's a cartoon all about a little boy having a picture taken of his willy, which is then pushed out over the internet. And what was said to us is this NSPCC making a joke out of online grooming? So we'll leave you to think about that, but it was very interesting, the comments we got in pouring scorn, really, on NSPCC's efforts there to protect children. What isn't the BBC reporting, Mike?
War. So here we've got, yesterday, following the meeting on Friday between Hollande, Merkel and Putin in Moscow, the same three plus Poroshenko held a conference call. And they agreed to hold a meeting this coming Wednesday in Minsk, if at all possible, and that meeting would be the Normandy format. This is the new buzzword is Normandy format, which just means that that Putin, Merkel, Hollande, and Poroshenko getting together. So it refers to the meeting of those leaders in whenever they met in June during the 70th anniversary of the Allies landing in Normandy during the Second World War. So anyway, if possible, they're going to have this meeting on Wednesday, but Putin, of course, is a little bit more cautious because he's saying we will be aiming for Wednesday if by that time we manage to agree on a number of points which we've been intensely discussing lately. Perhaps Merkel's presence in Washington today gives a clue as to what Putin's concerns are. Now, all this may be play acting, but it appears that there is a rift developing between the European leaders, at least on the surface, that's how it appears, between European leaders and Obama, because European leaders really concerned about the fact that Obama is pretty determined to arm the Ukrainians, because clearly Europe is a heck of a lot closer to Russia than the United States is. Not that that particularly matters, but as Lavrov said over the weekend, the United States and the European Union have taken steps to escalate the Ukraine crisis at every turn. Well, that's true, but it seems that, as I say, European leaders are pretty uncomfortable with the rhetoric and the boots on the ground situation escalating so closely to their borders. So Putin's pessimism undoubtedly comes from skepticism that European leaders can rein in Obama and NATO, particularly the issue of sending arms to Ukraine, and last week's announcement that NATO is again expanding into the Baltic states and into Poland and other countries. Der Spiegel Online then ran an article yesterday entitled NATO-Russia Crisis, the Nuclear Spectre Returns. And this article reports that the Ukraine crisis has put NATO and Russia back pretty much into a Cold War situation. It seems a bit hotter than that to me. And they're pointing out that there is no such thing as the red telephone anymore, so no communication, even between potentially on these kinds of issues between the United States and Russia. And the article reports that in '95, at the time of the Norwegian rocket incident, a decision to launch a counterstrike against a suspected first strike had been made in less than 10 minutes, and now the time available for that is less. Really pretty dangerous situation, according to Der Spiegel here, and they're warning that the danger of war is ever greater.
Ever greater, and we simply have a stunning silence on all these points by the BBC. We're having a bit of a focus on the BBC today for reasons that become apparent in a moment. But if you haven't seen the UK column article talking about the BBC's role in subversion in the former CIS states, Kazakhstan in particular, get on to the UK column website and have a read. People who've read the article there have been quite astonished to learn about what the BBC is really up to on a worldwide basis. So, as we learn nothing about war overseas, of course, what the public is focused on is the need to arm Britain's police forces. And the Mail here saying that more and more police are carrying guns when they're called out on routine calls. And surprisingly, they're saying that Thames Valley Police, remember Thames Valley Police, unable to stop a paedophile ring at Oxford and Cherwell Valley College, but they can put out 8,709 armed police response teams. So a huge number of constables being armed. And we're just going to say, of course, remember that it's a private company, ACPO, the Association of Chief Police Officers, which has now created some 6,000 fully armed police in Britain, private army armed with automatic weapons. And we would like to ask, when was this sinister policy debated in Parliament? Well, of course, it wasn't at all. So we have police chiefs simply making the decision that they're going to arm police officers on a routine call. It's taken Russia today to start to pull apart what's really going on in Britain. And of course, one of the things that many activists are watching very closely is the labelling of people who dare to challenge David Cameron's Conservative government. And the term is domestic extremists. This is the article from Russia Today, and they're saying, well, there's more and more police surveillance, and who are they looking at? Excellent cartoon here with a judge saying, I find you guilty of domestic extremism. Do you have anything to say for yourself? It's no good me telling him again, I'm innocent, he's made up his mind. So this is the BBC talking about, this is the BBC pumping out the propaganda, but it's taken Russia Today to actually identify the reality of Britain's secret courts. And what else has the BBC been doing? Well, it's this, a major news article identifying that a phallic structure has been put outside, I think it's a station in New Zealand, but this caught our attention because this news has been found by BBC Monitoring. So very important news. This is major news in Britain, a phallus in New Zealand, brought to us by BBC Monitoring. Strange that this sort of phallic image is mirrored here in UK. This particular statue was identified to us several years ago. I believe it's somewhere in the St Anne's area, but it's essentially a phallus with a girl's face. But let's look at BBC Monitoring. Here they are. And from 2013-14, BBC Monitoring no longer paid for by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. It's now paid by the licence fee payer. So we're going to say, do the public really pay a licence to gather soft porn from around the world? And if you're unhappy, please ring BBC Monitoring and express that unhappiness. And finally, this is what BBC Monitoring say they do. They're bringing the world to us. They're observing, understanding and explaining media throughout the world. So we called BBC Monitoring shortly before the programme to say, could you explain to us why you're promoting giant phalluses for the general public? Unfortunately, there was nobody to answer that question, and nobody at their desk, nobody at the end of the telephone, nobody monitoring.
Nobody. Well, back in the UK then, George Osborne is attempting to bribe pensioners. So here we've got the Financial Times talking about this. So pensioner bonds, these have been issued by National Savings and Investments. They offer a better interest rate than are available elsewhere, 4% for 3-year bonds. And they were hugely oversubscribed when they were launched in January. But so the government has now decided to extend that, and they're going to issue about £15 billion worth of bonds instead of £10 billion. Now, Osborne said yesterday that the extension is going to cost the taxpayer several hundreds of millions of pounds, and he did acknowledge that the government can borrow money more cheaply in the markets, but he says it is important to back savers in our economy. Well, what that actually means is important to bribe certain savers in time for the election. So let's contrast this with Egypt, who did much the same thing. They issued bonds which were only eligible for Egyptian citizens to apply for. The difference, and it is a key difference, is that these bonds were issued for a particular purpose, a particular productive purpose. And in this case, it's the expansion of the Suez Canal complex. So compare that with Osborne. He raises money from pensioners in order to bribe them to vote for him. What's he doing with the money raised? Nothing. Or he'll spend it on servicing Britain's debt. How many jobs will that create? None. I think that what the Egyptians have done is a pretty good idea. It's a form of national credit, in fact. I've no problem with money being borrowed at interest if it represents an investment by citizens, not by private corporations, in the development of a national asset. But bribing people the way that Osborne is bribing them is an absolute disgrace.
So without being unkind, many people would say Egypt, second world, third world country. That's the sort of language you hear, and yet here we see the Egyptians leading Britain with ways to get their economy and country back on track.
Yeah. Well, we can't not mention HSBC, of course. They're back in the news again, this time for helping people evade tax. Well, maybe they should be applauded for that. I don't know, under the present circumstances, since our own domestic terrorists are misusing the tax money that they gather. On the other hand, it is part and parcel of the asset stripping of the nation. And we've mentioned that, as we've just mentioned, the paying for votes. HSBC, not a nice organisation, of course, long established history of laundering drug money. But this story comes out of a leak several years ago, thousands of pages of data obtained by Le Monde newspaper in France. And then these documents have been passed to the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, The Guardian, Panorama, the BBC's Panorama, and 50 other media outlets. And it seems that HSBC wasn't just turning a blind eye to people hiding money in Switzerland. What they were in fact doing was actively helping them by issuing credit cards, which were issued in it's a foreign credit card, and they could withdraw money, which was undeclared as far as HMRC was concerned. So, you know, HSBC clearly breaking the rules again, hardly surprising, but then this government absolutely breaking the rules as well with what it does with the tax money. And one of the things that it isn't doing with our tax money is dealing with HSBC and the other banks. So let's have some Glass-Steagall perhaps, sort out this problem with the banks, but we also need to sort out the problem with government and how our tax money is being used. That's the point that I'd like to make.
And how we've got a government supporting a criminal international banking industry. Well, we'll end on the subject that, of course, money is extremely short in UK. There's no money for the NHS. There's no money for schools. There's no money for potholes in the road. There's no money to feed people. There is no money. But apparently there is money in Nottinghamshire Police Force because they've got money to celebrate LGBT. Here is their very large flag flying proudly at close up at the flagpole, and money no problem when it comes to this. So they still haven't managed to prosecute anybody through Operation Daybreak. We're still unsure at the moment as to where whistleblower and abuse victim Melanie Shaw is.
Well, in fact, they don't have any money to put people onto Operation Daybreak, do they?
No, absolutely right, Mike. Nottinghamshire Police said that they were so short of police officers that, well, when they could spare one off traffic duties, they could investigate child abuse crime. But clearly money for flags. And if you think this is limited to Nottinghamshire Police, well, you'd be wrong, because, of course, this is a common purpose agenda in the broadest sense of that phrase, because here we've got the new First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, north of the border, and she's saying, well, we're going to have an international envoy to support LGBT, and there's now an I added, which is, I believe, intersex, but I'm not sure what that means. And of course, Labour's jumped on the bandwagon, and well, we've got a fine man here, former EastEnders star, Lord Cashman, is going to be the new Labour envoy on LGBTI rights. So don't worry about money and feeding people. Let's get those flags up there, and let's make sure that we can represent Britain with an international rainbow envoy. If I sound scathing, it's intended, because this reflects the pitiful state of Britain at the moment as a result of the Lib Lab con. Well, that brings us to the end of today's news. Please have a look at the websites and have a look at the British Constitution Group conference, grand jury on child abuse. I think people who attend will be amazed at facts which will emerge during that grand jury, and there can be no positive change in Britain while we have people in power who are prepared to support criminal banks and, of course, as a minimum, cover up for paedophiles in high places. Sad state of affairs in Britain. We can do something about it. Join us tomorrow. Thank you.
Bye-bye.